Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Beyond Access series. My name is Jose Rios Lua. I'm the Director of Family Empowerment and Communications for the Division of Specialized Instruction and Student Support, and I will be your host this evening. I'm very excited to welcome back the Cerebral Palsy Foundation to continue our session on disability awareness. We're really excited for these amazing sessions. And before I hand it over to them, I have just a few housekeeping announcements. As a general reminder, during the sessions, the chat function is disabled, but you do have access to the Q&A function. And so you'll be able to type in your questions throughout the presentation. We also have some dedicated time towards the end of the session to answer all of your questions live. As always, this session is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube page tomorrow. So if you miss anything, don't worry. We're recording. You'll be able to go back. You'll be able to listen. Also, after you hear the amazing work of our partners at the Cerebral Palsy Foundation, you'll be able to forward that video off to other people and share the information on the wealth, because you're going to be so astounded by it, I'm sure. I also want to just let everyone know that if you missed last week, go back to our YouTube page and watch it. Even though all of these sessions are great as standalone sessions, we all think that you'll get the most benefit out of it if you see the entire 4-part series. So with that being said, I'm thrilled to introduce part 2 of this award-winning series as part of the Just Say Hi curriculum. Tonight's webinar is called Making Connections, Finding Common Ground. And our presenters are going to be focusing on the terms of ableism and allyship. And we hope to walk away with 5 actionable ways to facilitate making connections at our children's schools and in our communities. So without any further ado, Rachel, Ashley, good evening.
Thank you so much, Jose. And I will continue. Sorry, I'll just bring up the presentation. So yeah, as Jose said, this is part 2 of our 4-part series. And today we're going to be talking about making connections and finding common ground. So my name's Rachel Byrne. I'm the Executive Director at the Cerebral Palsy Foundation. I am a white woman with brown hair that's pulled back, and I'm wearing a white blouse, and I'm sitting actually in my house in New York City. And today we're intentionally varying our language usage between person-first language and identity-first language to respect the differing preferences of the disability community. Co-presenting with me today is Ashley Harris Whaley.
To be here with you all this evening. My name is Ashley Harris Whaley, and I am also a white woman, long curly brown hair, and I'm sitting in my office.
And to get us kick-started today, one of the amazing quotes that I want to share with you is from Carl Kachadurian, who actually was an old colleague of mine. And, you know, he also happens to be a good friend of Ashley's. But this is, I think, really sort of instills what, you know, the main messages that we're getting through today is, of course, disabled people want to be treated like everyone else. But when we say that, we don't mean treat every person exactly the same. We mean recognize our humanity and meet us where we are at. And I think it's really important when we're looking at the diverse spectrum of everyone who has disabilities, that really individualizing different opportunities for them is the most important. So I think before we begin, we need to start reminding ourselves that we are not far removed from students with disabilities being segregated in educational settings. And as Jose said, if you didn't catch last week's webinar, we really encourage you to go back and listen to that. We talked about disability history and laws and really showed where we've come from. But, you know, and we discussed sort of disability tropes surrounding disability, and we really have to reframe disability for peers so that disability becomes normalised and accepted, which leads to prevention of disabled students being subjected to humiliation, pity, and bullying. Tokenisation is symbolic inclusion with no meaning. And we really need to make sure when we're thinking about inclusion that we're not just ticking a box. This really has to be authentic and genuine. So to repeat it, what we don't want for our students is to be segregated or made to feel othered, to be pitied, to be humiliated, to experience bullying, to be assigned inappropriate expectations, and to be tokenized. What we do want for our students is to feel included, to feel accepted, to feel seen and to be heard. We want them to learn alongside their peers and to be held at appropriate expectations and make sure that they're not too high or too low. Most importantly, they need to be given a seat at the table and really be respected for what they bring to the table. Give them the opportunity to lead, give them the opportunity to really bring forth their ideas. So now I'm going to hand it over to Ashley to really think about, well, how do we ensure that these do's and don'ts aren't there?
Yeah, how are we sure that we are on the path to the do's and away from the don'ts, so to speak? So thankfully, we've got a pretty complex question here, but thank goodness it's a pretty simple answer. So the first element of that is accurate disability representation. And then the second element is, of course, inclusion. So representation plays a really crucial role in allowing students to see themselves in their worlds of learn and work and play. And representation normalizes disability for students who don't have disabilities. And it also reduces some of those earlier things we were talking about, like pitying or bullying or tokenization, because they see disability reflected in the world around them. And we want to continue to introduce you to members of the disability community that are doing incredible things that are speaking specifically to the power of inclusion. So first up is Tiffany Yu. Tiffany is the founder of Diversability. It's a phenomenal organization. It's an award-winning community business that aims to elevate disability pride through disability community, visibility, and engaged allyship. So we're going to introduce you to Tiffany and let you hear a bit of her story. So before she picks up here in our video, it's important to know that she's telling the story of a car accident that she experienced at the age of 9 that resulted in a brachial plexus injury and also the loss of her father. But rather than me telling you her story, we would just love for you to have the opportunity to hear a piece of it for yourself.
I was this 9-year-old girl who was just so angry. I was so angry at my dad that he created this new reality for me, and I was so angry and I was at war with myself and my body because I didn't want to deal with this. I wanted more than anything for things just to go back to the way they were. My mom, who was now a newly single parent, had to raise 4 kids on her own. And she did everything she could to make sure that we never had to worry about having a roof over our head or food on the table. But she worked so hard that it also meant that she was never home. And so I didn't get the support that I needed. And at school, gym class was this daily torture. I'd get dressed for this class every single day that no one wanted me to be at. At school, I felt so excluded, and at home, I felt so isolated. It's one thing to lose a parent, and it's another thing to acquire a disability, but it's a third thing to feel so isolated and alone. And the hardest part of all of this, it wasn't losing my dad, and it isn't having a disability, it's how I was treated in the years that followed. Chronic exclusion, repeated exclusion, creates irreversible trauma. And it's not the kind of thing you just get over as you get older, nor does it disappear over time. Time doesn't heal all wounds. It took me 12 years before I spoke publicly about the car accident and what had happened to me. And that's 12 years of shame that 2 decades later, I'm still working to explore and heal. So what happened? I'd always noticed that people seemed pretty uncomfortable with disability. And as a result, they were uncomfortable with me. And all I really wanted was to be liked, to be accepted, to be understood. The truth is we don't really understand disability, so we don't know how to talk about it. We're so afraid of saying something offensive or not politically correct that we end up saying nothing at all. And because of that, we rely on stereotypes in the media, which oftentimes portray disability as a medical diagnosis, a tragedy, or a charity case, which is very much rooted in pity and how I saw my own story, or as a function of our external social environment and attitudes. But the problem with these mindsets is that they're rooted in assumptions that people with disabilities can't achieve and can't dream, and because of that, we're not even given the chance to succeed. And we start to believe that for ourselves. We see the disability and we judge the ability. But the thing is, no one asked me how I wanted to be viewed. What happens when we look at disability as identity, as part of the fabric of who we are? And similar to other aspects of identity, it can be rooted in pride and empowerment. There's no pity, there's no victimization, there's no shame.
As we've heard from Tiffany, she says it best herself, but inclusion is so powerful, y'all. It's so powerful. And genuine connections are what's found at the heart of that, right? So how are we making sure that our students are fully equipped to make these kinds of connections?
And so to the core of thinking about how do we make connections, how do we form authentic friendships, is social emotional learning. And I'm sure you've heard this terminology before, and there's actually a couple of webinars in the Beyond Access series that go deeper into this. But when we're thinking about social emotional learning, particularly in its relation to disability inclusion, we want to think about self-awareness. So recognizing one's emotions and values, as well as one's strengths and challenges. Thinking about responsible decision-making. So making sure that students are making ethical, constructive choices about personal and social behavior. Thinking about relationship skills, so forming positive relationships, working in teams, dealing effectively with conflict. Social awareness, so showing understanding and empathy for others. And of course, self-management, so managing emotions and behaviors to achieve one's goals. And one of the interesting things is when we think about social emotional learning and how it's facilitated in schools, sometimes students with disability are actually left out of the conversation. So it needs to be embedded within programs, and it needs to actually bring students with disability to the forefront of that. And so this is just a little video that actually focuses on social emotional learning and actually some of the benefits of social emotional learning.
I'm a data guy, I like numbers, and we have a lot of evidence that social emotional learning has made a difference.
We had a graduation rate of 62%. Last year, we put up a record-breaking 84%.
Over the last 5 years, our expulsions have been cut in half.
We were suspending about 13,000 days of out-of-school suspension. We were 10 times the average for any school district in Ohio. And within that first year alone, we were able to reduce our out-of-school suspensions by 55%.
Attendance rates went up. We know that attendance is directly correlated to academic improvement and achievement, but it also had other outcomes that were extremely important, which is students feeling more connected to schools, educators having to think outside the box, helping students overcome some of the challenges that are in their life.
There's an 11-to-1 return on investment. So for every dollar invested in programming around social emotional learning, we're seeing that they're saving $11 on remedial programs, dropout prevention. There's lots of reasons that people are coming to the conclusion that this is something that we need to be prioritizing.
So you might ask, why is it important to relate social emotional learning to disability inclusion? Well, I think when we think about it, here are some interesting insights, and these are from the National Centre for Learning Disabilities. Only 50% of educators feel comfortable implementing an IEP or a 504 plan, and only 17% feel confident in teaching students with mild to moderate learning disabilities. So to put it lightly, this isn't great to hear, right? Like we're starting to get concerned. But the good news is that we can do better and change the narrative, and disability inclusion commitments that integrate principles of social emotional learning go a long way towards education empathy, and empowerment for all involved in our school environments. And so I think it's really important when we think about all those different things that they talk to the positive of, realizing that students with disability are really impacted in those on the daily. I'll now hand it back over to Ashley to talk about friendships and peer-to-peer relationships.
So let's think about our school experiences, right? Our student experiences. What connections were at the heart of that? And it's, you know, while you can have like meaningful connections with your educators and other members of your school community, the real meat and potatoes of the situation is the friendships that you're making and the peer-to-peer relationships that you're forming at school, in school activities. And so how can we make sure that all of our students are benefiting from these connections? And in recent years, you know, we can really see easily the value of a close friendship and how friendships really help us like buffer through pretty stressful life events like, you know, a global pandemic. And think back to what Tiffany said earlier about the power of exclusion and the trauma that comes with that. And pandemic separation from all of our peer groups and our personal connections, like those are big and heavy things, right? And so a lack of friendships and a lack of connection, it really unfortunately leads to some increased anxiety and maybe some increased depression. But the good news is that we can use friendships as tools to improve things like self-esteem or independence, or a really big one, a person's sense of belonging, or their confidence and their empowerment, and probably the most important of all, their just joy. Friendships and connections as tools to facilitate all of these things. And in terms of mental health, we have to acknowledge that even with friendships and even with connections, the world keeps going and the mental health crises are still experienced, right? It's important to recognize that and to recognize needing help and seeking that help and the importance of that and what a brave thing it is to do. And as adults in the situation, you know, we need to make sure that we're checking in on our students and that we are helping them facilitate connections with appropriate resources as needed. So students with disabilities, right, they deserve all of the benefits that close friendships offer too, right? You may not often think of folks with disabilities being included in those kinds of conversations, but it's the absolute truth. We are people too, and we deserve all the benefit of friendship and connection. And just to talk about a little of my own personal experience, I think it's probably a decently atypical one. I was really lucky as a disabled person, you know, during my school years to fully experience the value of genuine. If you can't tell from my accent, I grew up in a really very small, very rural town in Southern Appalachia. And I went to the kind of school that literally had less than 1,000 students in grades 6 through 12. So I went to school with kids that my parents had went to school with their parents. And beyond that, my grandparents had went to school and played sports and known their grandparents. So super, super close-knit community. And it's hard for me to narrow down specific core memories that really shaped my school experience. It all was really so positive, but one thing that I can think of, one like hallmark of a true friendship I experienced all through school, and we're still friends now, many years later, was my best friend, Rachel. We met on the first day of kindergarten, and each year we were required to run a mile in gym class. I don't know if that's like a ubiquitous American experience or if that is like unique to rural Appalachia. I really don't know, but we were required to run a mile. And each year she would finish the mile with me because was always behind everyone else. You know, all my classmates were already in the stands. They were eating their bagged lunch from home. But every year she would finish the mile with me, and all my classmates would stand up and cheer us across the finish line as I finished. So I had a really, truly unique experience of true acceptance in school. And the reality is that every disabled student should be afforded some version of that experience, right? So with that in mind, you know, what can we do for our students to help facilitate those? Despite what our name might suggest, we know that the key to initiating a successful conversation, and all friendships theoretically begin with conversations, right? It's not as simple as just saying hi, especially as students get older. You don't just walk up to yourself or to someone and interject yourself into their conversation and go, "Hi, my name is Ashley." That's just not how social interaction always works, right? The actual relationships and conversations that we form with others, it's so much more complex than that. And recognizing that there are components of conversations and ways that we create friendships with others, things like common interests, right? Feeling comfortable with one another, exploring topics with one another, and reciprocal communication and interaction. In the age of the internet, in the world that we live in, so much of our interaction now is very one-sided. It can feel that way and it can be that way. And it's becoming at times increasingly difficult to separate this from genuine reciprocal interaction. And it's really important to recognize and acknowledge the difficulty of initiating conversations. You know, what some of us might think of as a simple ask or a simple interaction, no big deal. Maybe something that's not easy or even difficult for other folks. Social communication is a developed skill. That's my speech language pathologist background coming out a little bit, but it truly is a skill that you have to work at and develop. It's not often innate for most people. And if you have a student or a connection to a student that could use some extra assistance in the area of social communication, there are all kinds of programs that are available to kind of facilitate the learning of that. And one example of that is the Peers program through UCLA. And I think, you know, another component of friendships that we don't often talk kind of frankly about is they can have seasonality to them, right? So the old adage is that for some, you know, friendships, there are reasons, some friendships, there's a season, and some friendships are for a lifetime. And I remember, like, as a kid and as an adolescent, really not always getting that. It's right. It's hard. It can be hard to acknowledge that not all friendships stick around for the long time or for the long haul. And equipping our students to sort of deal with that and understand that and give themselves the permission to let friendships sort of ebb and flow as they will. So moving on to our next slide, for more of an additional introduction to the disability community, I want to introduce y'all to some of my absolute favorite people. They're a husband and wife duo. They're both disabled, and their names are Lucy and James Catchpole. And Lucy and James are great friends of mine. I have recently worked with them on a book project, and they own a children's literary agency in the UK. And back in 2021, James released a book called What Happened to You? And it's very reflective of his own childhood experience. And the book really talks about what conversation isn't, right? And the point of that being that conversation isn't asking disabled people personal or invasive questions. I think often that's a prevailing narrative that gets pushed around, that, oh, if you see a disabled person, be that an adult or a peer to a child or student, that it's perfectly all right just to go up and ask them any question that you'd like to satisfy your curiosity. And this book really speaks to why that's problematic and kind of reinforces that the rules for establishing conversation and connection through dialogue and through commonalities, like that's not often an experience that's afforded disabled people. Instead, we just get the questions. So this book does a phenomenal job of teaching kids sort of another way of engaging, a way that's more true to life. So I'm going to let you watch the book trailer for that book. Rachel talked about earlier, we have to embed social and emotional learning within disability inclusion. And that's not what we were seeing there in those examples in that book trailer and in those questions. And that's why a book like this and an understanding of social and emotional learning and passing that forward, like that's why that's so needed, because what this is highlighting is kids can, and in my experience, most often do ask questions in a way that aren't meant to be hurtful or serious. Like some of those questions that were asked, like, was it a lion? Was it 1,000 lions? Like that, there's no malice there, right? There's no ill intent, but those kinds of questions, if you're hearing them over and over and over again, especially as a means of engagement, if that's how your peers are trying to engage with you, that can be very wearing, and that can still end up having a pretty significant impact. And impact matters so much more than intent. And James just really explores that in the book, that those kinds of questions are often the default, and that really isn't the way, so to speak. So rather than doing that, we should instead allow what's at the heart of disability inclusion to guide making true connections within the disability community. So things like mutual respect, or friendliness and kindness, or readiness to get to know one another, discovering common interests, embracing differences, learning from one another, and understanding how we can best support one another. These things, they seem to me like they should be pretty obvious, right? But unfortunately, many people don't let these basic principles guide them in forming their connections with members of the disability community. The core of disability inclusion is recognizing and respecting the humanity of people with disabilities. And in doing that, that's your baseline. If you do that, all of these other things can be allowed to organically happen.
Thanks, Ashley. I think, they're so really important things to remember. And one of the other important things to remember is that disability inclusion is woven throughout a school community. So it's not just in the classroom or in the playground or in the lunchroom. It's on school buses, it's in after-school programs, it's in the neighborhood, and it's even in your home. And I think the more that we can actually bridge those gaps and think about, well, how do we create authentic relationships? How do we create true connections and change the dialogue around disabilities? Will go a long way into thinking about how students with disabilities have that sense of belonging in school. So I think really sort of next steps. All right, so what are we going to do about this? what can we think about? Well, what does allyship look like? What are some actionable moments that we can take? So I think when we're thinking about understanding allyship and everything that's going on in development of a relationship, we want to steer away from empty action and obviously the charity model. What we want to do is we want to raise students with disabilities, their voices alongside others, not on behalf of. We want to make sure that we're listening and deferring to disabled voices. And that's our students in our schools. It's thinking about, well, who are our teachers? Who is part of our leadership? Who's actually coming and bringing forth this information? Individuals with disabilities can also be allies. So I think it's important not to be left out of the conversation. As we said, these are really about creating reciprocal relationships. And just because you have a disability doesn't mean you can't be an ally to somebody else. Being obviously immersed in disability representation, throughout this series, you're going to meet some incredible individuals who are doing phenomenal things across lots of different industries. And I think it's really important to always bring that back and say, okay, what does it look like? And of course, making genuine connections. Ashley's told you about wonderful things that she had in school, the experiences that she had. Obviously, we heard from Tiffany, who had a really sort of opposite experience to that. But how do we make those genuine connections? Well, it's through all those different things about having genuine conversations and making sure we're facilitating that with students with disabilities and without disabilities. So it's not just at a superficial level. And also really encouraging, okay, questions are okay if they're appropriate. But make sure that you actually know somebody before you're asking any personal questions, and maybe start a conversation with something else instead so that you can actually form genuine relationships. So truthfully, a lot of that conversation in the broader disability circles really starts to revolve around adults, right? Like we're all sort of talking about this as adults. Okay, how can we be good allies? But students should be included in the conversations of allyship as well, because they can be allies too. And I think it's really important why we're teaching all these different things in schools, right, is so that they can be allies and they can feel like, all right, we're part of this conversation. We're part of a shift and a change within our school community to make sure that we're more inclusive.
So what, in the grand scheme of this conversation, what is Just Say Hi? What's our inclusion program bringing to the table? So it brings the work that's required for allyship, right? Embedding concepts of social and emotional learning into literally every element of conversation, of friendship, and of leadership within schools. So we're going to show you a little video clip that illustrates how in the school environment, allyship can look like a lot of different things. Right? So here are some examples of what students who've actually participated in the Just Say Hi program feel that allyship brings to the table.
We're talking about differences, right? We're talking about including people who are different.
I feel as though a lot of people are going to be more aware of how they treat other people.
And it just helps kids feel more comfortable, and it just helps with the integration that goes on in the school.
Unless you're willing to set aside some time and just have the kid talk about it, I don't think they'll truly be able to understand us to a point where they can actually help us.
So that video clip speaks a lot to learning and developing and understanding. And really what we know is that learning is truly a lifelong experience. It never stops. Debbie likes to say all the time, every day is a school day for every one of us, and it's honestly the truth. And what does the journey of lifelong learning look like? It looks like, receiving new information, absorbing that and applying it, studying and growing, and giving yourself room to allow your perspectives to change. It's definitely going to look like slipping up and making mistakes. None of us are immune to it. It happens to the best of us. But then when that happens, we begin the process of unlearning pretty harmful ideologies and practices that might have been either directly or indirectly enforced. And it looks like getting called in and being held accountable whenever that needs to happen. And of course, as always, clinging to our communities and working together and being willing to falter or maybe even fail sometimes. And in the face of that, you just keep moving forward. And truly, our aim is for Just Say Hi to help facilitate this journey of lifelong learning for anybody in the school community that comes in contact with the program. So let's look at our next video clip, which really speaks to how inclusion and a true posture of allyship is at the core of the Just Say Hi program and its mission.
Thank you. There are many of us out there who think that we're doing inclusion right and we don't have to do anything else to be inclusive, but it's important to have a program to help our students understand why inclusion is important.
Kids are growing up with things that they're used to. They don't know what to do with someone that may be different.
If somebody's in a wheelchair, they don't know how to talk to them.
I wish that people understood about how it feels like to have a disability.
The Just Say Hi curriculum has served as an anchor and a scaffold for how we can look critically at our curriculum.
And like as you say hi, there are other things you can talk about, and that really helps to make new friends.
If a new kid came into the school, I would say, welcome to the class.
What makes a great school is a culture and climate to the building that celebrates diversity and rallies the community around supporting every single child.
So now we're going to give you a little look at our Just Say Hi program. So it began 5 years ago as a collaboration between CPF, between the New York City Department of Education and NYU Langone. It's a three-pronged curriculum for all stakeholders because it's not just students who are a part of the school community. It's, of course, it is students, both with disabilities and without, but it's also parents and families and guardians. It's educators and it's other school faculty and staff. Really, it's everyone. So our Just Say Hi program provides for all of these stakeholders, robust professional development for educators and staff. It's all steeped in really evidence-based content and best practices. It's all peer-reviewed and co-developed with experts and stakeholders, disabled professionals themselves. Pretty fabulous. So that kind of learning for the professional development segment is available in both synchronous and asynchronous formats. And a really cool part of the whole deal is that we have co-developed more than 84 or 85 cross-curricular disability inclusion lesson plans with state-sanctioned school counselors of the year and teachers of the year. So we really have expert involvement on this. We have educators with disabilities, education professors in curriculum and instruction, and allies. Our lesson plan compendium includes a really diverse group of plans that span across ELA, SEL, history, STEM, the arts, you name it. It's designed to be used wherever and whenever within a school that it's needed. And as a matter of fact, we actually have a lesson plan for pre-K that focuses on James Catchpole's book that we touched on earlier. So they really are incredibly well done. And the third portion of that is that we're delivering this webinar series and other Inclusion Matters-based trainings that provide learning platforms for families and other stakeholders. And if there isn't a school-wide disability curriculum at your school, and if these conversations around disability inclusion aren't happening at your school, our program is a really comprehensive way to facilitate those conversations and get them started. So how can you bring Just Say Hi to your school? You can spread the word about the Just Say Hi program. We would really love your involvement to make these things happen. You can advocate for bringing it to your school, reaching out to your school administrators, engaging your PTA leaders to bring a family engagement webinar to your school community, and continuing to advocate for disability inclusion as the best interest of really your entire school community. Disabled kids deserve a curriculum that makes them feel seen, makes them feel heard, and a curriculum that works to help ensure that they're fully community. Every disabled kid deserves the kind of experience that I had, and while we can't replicate that exactly, we can work at it, and Just Say Hi can definitely be a piece of that overall effort. So thank y'all so much for your time this evening. We've really enjoyed talking with y'all, and I think Jose is going to take it away and open the floor for questions.
Absolutely. So folks, start typing in your questions. We have a couple in here, and I have some questions for y'all as well. But one of the questions in here is, how do you all have any recommendations about how to manage anger when situations happen, when you are the parent of a child with a disability and someone approaches your child with something disrespectful? It's really easy for that to cause anger, right? Even if it's not intended. So any thoughts on how to approach those situations or how to manage them?
Yeah, I think you can actually be honest. And I think this is sometimes you can, while we don't encourage that every conversation has to be a learning experience for others, but if someone does approach you and it does cause you anger and it does cause you, to feel a certain way, let them know. And you don't necessarily have to do it, obviously, in an angry way, but you can say, I'm not okay with that question. I don't feel comfortable answering that. Thank you very much, sort of move on. Obviously, there's always, you can ignore it and walk away, but there are always these opportunities to let people know that that wasn't okay. And while sometimes it's like, okay, I'm going to be the bigger person, I'm going to do all those different things, people won't learn if they don't know, right? It's one of those sort of old things, like you don't know what you don't know, and maybe no one has ever actually let them know, okay, what you just said was actually offensive. What you just said really hurt me. And that would sort of be our encouragement. I think that goes back to when we're thinking about the principles of social emotional learning, right? How do we, facilitate that discussion? And as adults, I think it's important that we do scaffold that for our child. So say, for example, if your child's there, how you respond is a way for them to think, well, how am I meant to respond? And if we always respond saying, oh, okay, that's amazing, you ask away, talk about it, it sort of reinforces what we sort of saw in that book, which was, all right, we're going to continue to ask those questions and say it's okay. So I do think it's all right to actually say, all right, that wasn't okay and I'm not comfortable with it. Ashley, do you have anything to add to that one?
Yeah, I co-sign everything you just said. I think, ideally, if you take the opportunity to let someone know that something wasn't okay, we can hope that that's going to inform their future interactions, right? We can hope that the next time they encounter somebody with a disability, they might think back on that and think, oh, the last time I asked, what's wrong with you? That really didn't go over well. So hopefully, we're just keeping the learning experience moving along.
That's also why I think when we look at the broader school community, that this program isn't just focused, as we said, in the school. It's not just focused in the classroom. It really is looking at every other component, because we know that these conversations still happen in the workplace, still happen, even in just adult to adult interactions. We've all got a lot to learn. And I think that trying to be that role model for your child is really important.
Is there anything you would add? Because I think that's really great advice when there's like a large overt type of behavior. But is there anything you would want to add around maybe like microaggressions that might happen around, and microaggressions that families and children might face?
Yeah, I'll go first, Ashley, but then please, jump in. I think with microaggressions, you actually have to protect yourself. So obviously microaggressions can be happening constantly. And so I think there's got to be moments where you're preserving your own energy and thinking about, well, what am I giving out here? So, we usually in response to microaggressions, if they're a little bit passive aggressive or they're not quite there, you feel like, all right, it's always my responsibility to be the bigger person, to act in a certain way. But I think there's times where you can potentially not answer and shut down a conversation or walk away or not, have to be the educator in that moment, because it gets too much. I think Tiffany, explained it really well in her video, that for her, exclusion was turned into trauma, and people asking questions can turn into trauma. So I would just think about, how do we protect ourselves? How do we protect our child? And that's not always your responsibility to be the educator. And I think with microaggressions, it's obviously difficult because sometimes they come and you don't want to be seen as overreacting, but I think you are absolutely, give yourself permission to protect yourself.
Yeah, I would agree with that fully. It can be a tricky balance. I mean, I've had to learn, I'm still learning how to deal with those kinds of things. And I wish there were like some easy prescription for every instance, but there's really not. I take a pretty varied approach. It kind of depends honestly on like how I'm feeling on any given day. I might choose to address it, usually pretty bluntly. I might just let it roll and decide that it's not worth my energy or my time. It might be some combination of the two, where I just kind of shut down the conversation and I don't feel the need to offer an explanation of why, because it really is taxing to deal with those kinds of things on and on and on. So I would just, maybe this is chancy, but just let your feelings guide you. You'll know what to do.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of it depends.
I was going to say, don't feel bad about those feelings.
No, never.
That's the tricky thing, that sometimes you're like, oh, I wish I didn't react that way. Give yourself a moment to go, okay, I reacted that way because it might not have been that moment, but it might have been the 10 before. And so I think it's okay to give yourself permission to feel and to go, okay, whoa, that sort of turned out not the way I was expecting, but, not to give yourself a hard time about it, because we know that there is so much to do in relation to these conversations. And I suppose that's why a program like Just Say Hi and disability inclusion and embedding that within social emotional learning is so important, because we want to, in a way, minimize how much of these sort of microaggressions are just happening within the community, and particularly the school community.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think that that's what the great work that things like Just Say Hi, curriculum like Just Say Hi would do, is prepare you to respond in those situations, how you feel you should respond in that situation, right? Because I think something that Ashley said was key, like there is no one right answer, right? Because when we're approaching in those situations, you kind of have to take a quick inventory of yourself, right? Be like, where am I emotionally right now to be able to handle this? Who is this person in front of me? Do I have a relationship where I can, call them in or call them out, type of thing? And you're actually in that moment of a microaggression, negotiating all those things at once. So I love the idea of like just being a little easy on yourself when those things are happening and going with what you need. And I'm also realizing that, we just talked about the term microaggression very casually. Could you all help define what a microaggression is and what they might look like to someone with a disability?
Ashley, do you want to do this one?
Oh, I don't know if this is going to be the best definition of all time. It's very on the fly, but think of a microaggression as just a tiny slight against a disabled person, be that through action or words or behavior. And those kinds of things, they're small. They seem small in the moment. They might even seem harmless, right? But over time, they really begin to accumulate. They pile up, and the disabled person gets pretty tired of them. I'm trying to think of some examples. So for me, my disability is very visible when I'm up and moving around. So typically I get a lot of comments, stares. So just like, blatant staring, an occasional unhinged jaw, all of those things are microaggressions. A comment that was made to me yesterday in a fairly professional setting was that I am exceedingly high functioning and educated. as a disabled person. It was meant as a compliment. There was no malice, no ill intent behind it whatsoever. It was meant as an absolute compliment, but it wasn't entirely received that way. And so that's kind of what a microaggression is. There usually isn't like overt ill intent behind it, but it very often comes across as like being patronizing or minimizing to someone's experience living with a disability. So I hope that helped.
Yeah,
there
no,
are
that's really
probably
helpful.
better resources than me out there on microaggressions and how to identify them, but
I think a really good example too is I have a friend who has CP who manifests, their CP manifests in the way they talk. And so one of the things that is a microaggression to them is when people constantly try to finish their sentences, or try to finish the word that they're trying to say. Like someone's trying to be helpful, but it's actually very insulting. It almost kind of takes the power away from a person. I know that like that's one of the examples of a friend of mine that they live every single day. And I can't, if I had a nickel for every time I would get a text message saying, do you know how incredibly insulting it is when this happens? And on that front, I think, so you all use the term calling in the presentation. And so I wanted to see if you all could talk a little bit more about the differences between calling in and calling out. Because I think we all do both and may not even realize that we're doing it. And maybe we can talk a little bit about when it's why calling in might be a little more helpful depending on the relationship we have with folks.
Ashley, do you want to do that one?
I'll do my best. So
you're on a roll.
Well, we think of calling out as like not quite a criticism and not quite a reprimand, but somewhere in that neighborhood, right? And we think of calling in. I get called in on the internet all the time, y'all, if I do something that someone doesn't agree with. It's more of like making a person aware of maybe something that they could have done differently, but doing it in a way that's as an ally and as like a colleague or a friend or an acquaintance, depending on the level of your relationship, but doing it in a congenial way rather than an inflammatory way. Sometimes, a good calling out is necessary. Typically, that comes from people that you don't have like direct personal relationships, right? It's like hard to call out your mom. She's not going to allow it. But like if my mom says something like off color, which, she has a disabled kid, but like she's not immune to saying things that aren't always right on the button. I'm not going to call her out. I'm just going to be like, hey, mom, did you know that this is a thing? Like, did you know that you could have said that in a better way, or that so-and-so, the community prefers it this way? It's more of a learning opportunity than an admonishment. So I hope that helps.
No, I think that's great. And I tend to think about calling in versus calling out based on like the intent behind the action. So like if something is in my mind, and I'm not saying this is right, I'm saying this is how I approach it. In my mind, if something is malicious, that's something worth calling out. If something isn't, if there's no malicious intent behind it, then that's an opportunity to call someone in and maybe build that bridge of allyship. Right?
I love that framing, Jose. Yeah. That's fabulous. I'm going to use that.
Next time somebody
asks me this question.
I think that's spot on, Jose, because I think, going back to what all this is about, right? Making connections and creating authentic relationships and what that looks like. Obviously, and, we spoke about bullying and all those different things, we really need to sort of judge it for where that relationship is at that time. For example, if someone is being malicious and you don't even know them and you've never sort of had any interaction with them, calling them out may be very appropriate, because at that moment you don't feel safe in calling them in, right? Like when you're calling someone in, you've really created a trusted relationship usually, or that you trust that the conversation is going to be potentially productive and it's going to be able to be moved forward. When you're calling out, sometimes, it really is. But I think that the important thing is, though, is that if you want a good relationship and you're wanting to do those different things, sometimes calling out can be the opposite of what you want to achieve, right? And so I think there is those moments where depending on your relationship, depending on what your end goal is, depending on, you know, all those different factors, that just realizing that calling out doesn't feel great on the receiving end. So just thinking about if you're trying to empower that individual, if you want them to become an ally, you know, calling out can really feel like you're getting reprimanded. And sometimes, depending on what the action was, whether it's, you know, worthy or not, that can actually halt a conversation. It can actually, you know, break down a relationship. So, you know, and I think this is why these things are so important, because it's not simple. These are all complex. And I think that's the nature when we're talking about and having conversations around disability inclusion, where for so long there's been this stigma and bias and everything's been attached to it. So there's so many emotions attached. And, you know, to be able to create safe spaces for conversations and so that there is a, you know, trusted conversations, I think is really important. And, you know, one of the things that is the biggest challenge actually is having people being able to trust that this is a safe place, or to trust that, you know, what the end outcome is going to look like.
Rachel, Ashley, we could keep going for hours. I know we could, but I'm looking forward to the next 2 sessions to keep going deeper in this. Thank you for all the information you've shared tonight. I'm really, truly, honestly, looking forward to these next 2 sessions, and of course, your participation in our family forum. Folks at home, please share this recording with anybody who in your life who needs this. And honestly, everybody needs this. Everyone could use a refresher, even if you think you're the most knowledgeable person. So please share that link when we share it with you all. I know some of you noticed that we don't have ASL interpretation live with us tonight, but don't worry, those of you who are watching it in YouTube land will see Greenie join. We're gonna add this in post-production, so everyone will have ASL in the recording. And I think those are all the major announcements. So thank you again for joining us, to our Cerebral Palsy Foundation partners, and we'll see you all next week. Have a great night, everyone.
Thanks so much, everybody.